Greetings. Welcome to Ghosts R N.E.A.R, where we discuss and explore paranormal phenomena. I am your host, Keith Johnson, the founder of New England Anomalies Research. With me is my co-host,
Sandra Johnson. Did you miss me?
Glad to have you back, Sandra. We're currently on location in Salem, Massachusetts, and we're exploring some of the history of Salem, Massachusetts, in particular, the Salem Witch Hysteria, which took place here in 1692. So please join us as we investigate various locations which have that rich history.
This 8-acre common has been a public area in Salem since the town's beginnings. As early as 1685, it served as a shooting range used by men preparing for military service. Originally, part of the common was swampy, with little hills and ponds. Farm animals were allowed to graze on the grounds. In the early 19th century, the ground was leveled off and drained. Today's Salem Common is bound by Washington Square Streets north, south, east, and west. The Common holds vendors and music festivals and a popular place for residents and visitors to relax. This is the old Phillips Elementary School, which was used for Max's High School in Hocus Pocus, which the exterior has been seen at the beginning of the film when Max and Allison exit the school and Allison gives back Max's telephone number.
The Colonial Revival 6-story Hawthorne Hotel was opened on July 23rd of 1925. 6 fires plagued the land's previous occupant, the Franklin Building, during the 1800s. In 1830, the Salem Marine Society, founded in 1766, moved to this site. A small building replicating the Tariatopan, a sailing ship from Salem's East India trade with nautical decor, was added on the hotel's rooftop for the Society's headquarters and meeting place as a property sale condition. The hotel has a nautical theme, including its library, having an appearance of a ship's interior.
The Witch Museum, originally built as a church in 1845, became a museum in 1972. Is a place with wax effigies of the victims and the magistrates who sentenced them. The museum's objective is to give an accurate and distinct depiction of the witch trials and to provide a brief overview of what witchcraft is today and of the belief system. The exhibit hall includes various portrayals of witches of folklore, television, and movies. As you stand in a room with the exhibits towering above you, an ominous voice recants the events that unfolded in the Witch City in 1692. In front of the Witch Museum is a statue of Salem's founder, Roger Conant, who is often mistaken as a witch in his Puritan garb. He was the Salem's first governor in 1626 to 1628.
This old Gothic Salem's Jail sprawling structure looms over this cemetery. From the year of about 1813 until its closure, this Salem jail housed a number of criminals. This brick jail featured a main jailhouse with more than 100 cells, a separate jailer's residence, and a wooden barn. When the jail first opened, condemned prisoners were executed by hanging in the dining room, which had a trap door in the floor. Convicted Boston Strangler Albert DeSalvo spent time in this jail. The jail was determined to be inhumane to house prisoners and was shut down in 1991, making it the oldest operating prison in the country at the time. The city of Salem has fought to keep this ominous-looking historical landmark alive. In 2006, plans were set in motion to turn the jail buildings into condominiums, townhouses, a restaurant, and an art studio, and the ribbon-cutting ceremony took place on May 27, 2010. Locals claim to have seen shadow figures and full-bodied apparitions of former prisoners and a prison guard holding a clipboard on the grounds.
The 70 feet by 280 feet colonial dungeon that was constructed by hand-hewn oak timbers and siding that many of the accused were imprisoned was built in 1684, and it was the third dungeon in Salem. Prisoners were charged fees for everything, such as their salted food, herring, pickled mixed drink, lodging, removal of a body for burial, salaries and expenses of all persons concerned with the court, and any items of comfort, such as a blanket and clean clothing, had to be supplied by friends or family. The jail was cold, foul, and rat-infested. In 1764, the jail expanded with the addition of a second and third floor. It was discontinued as new jail was built across the street in 1813. The old jail passed into private ownership and used as a residence. Over the years, it deteriorated and was given little historical attention until 1934, and in response to public inquiries, opened to the public in 1935.
St. Peter's was founded in 1733, and a wooden structure was built on land donated by Philip English, a wealthy merchant. At age 19, Philip English arrived in Salem in 1670. After marrying Mary, the daughter of William Hollingsworth, a shipping tycoon, he became extremely wealthy in his own right in shipping and trade. On the night of April 18, 1692, Sheriff George Corwin and his deputies arrested Mary on charges of witchcraft. After 3 weeks in jail in Salem, Mary was sent to prison in Boston. Philip was sent to join his wife in confinement when he unsuccessfully tried to break Mary out. While out on leniency, they fled to New York to wait out the hysteria. Upon their return, in May of 1693, they found their estate plundered by Sheriff Corwin. A year later, Mary died after giving birth. Philip was buried 42 years later in St. Peter's Cemetery. The chapel in the rear of the church was built on top of part of the cemetery.
Though the Museum Place Mall was built in the 1970s, it sits on the land occupied by Samuel Beadle's Taverns, where, in 1692, witnesses reported seeing a spectral pig, including John Westgate, who claimed he was attacked by a spectral pig sent by witch trials victim Alice Parker.
This Salem restaurant was built upon the former site of Bridget Bishop's property. In 1692, she was found guilty and hanged. On February 12, 1877, Alexander Graham Bell made long-distance telephone conversations and news dispatches here.
In 1692, the Salem courthouse stood here, where all 19 persons executed as witches were tried and condemned by the Court of Oyer and Terminer. The 17th century structures are long gone, but a plaque marks the spot.
In 1692, the meeting house of the first church stood on this site. On April 11th, Sarah Cloyce and John and Elizabeth Proctor were examined here. On the day of her trial, Bridget Bishop Spector reportedly pried up a plank from the meeting house and sent it about the interior. Barely 1 month later, on July 3rd, Rebecca Nurse was brought here and was publicly excommunicated.
Dedicated on June 15, 2005, this statue depicts Samantha Stevens. Many believe she is pointing to Salem's Gallows Hill.
Salem's only standing building with direct ties to the witch trials. The 17th century home of Judge Jonathan Corwin, who was famous for interrogating and condemning the accused. He lived there for 40 plus years, and his family owned it until the mid-1800s.
2 first church members were excommunicated from this church after being arrested for practicing witchcraft, Rebecca Nurse and Giles Corey, but restored as church members in 1992.
The Rose Mansion made a brief but memorable cameo in the Salem-based flick Hocus Pocus as the exterior of Allison's house. If the house is not open for tours, the gardens are worth seeing.
The Broad Street Cemetery was established in 1655 and is the second oldest and one of the smaller resting places in Salem. The cemetery sits on a small mound called Law's Hill. Within this cemetery lie the remains of George and Jonathan Corwin, together with other members of that extensive family.
George, who was only 25 at the time of the hysteria, served as the High Sheriff of Essex County in 1692. In this capacity, he directed the confiscation of property from those convicted of witchcraft and carried out the death sentences of the 19 who were hanged and the pressing of Giles Corey for refusing to stand trial.
Sheriff George Corwin died of a heart attack in 1692 at the age of 30. George's funeral in 1697 was delayed by Philip English, who sought to recoup some of the fortune Corwin had seized from him in 1692 when English stood accused of witchcraft.
By then he was so despised that his family had no choice but to bury him in the basement of his home at the current location of the Joshua Ward House, rather than run the risk of his tomb being desecrated. Many years later, his remains were moved to the Broad Street Cemetery. Jonathan Corwin, the owner of the still-standing witch house, died on June 9th, 1718, at the age of 78.
The Joshua Ward House was built on the foundation of the home of Sheriff George Corwin. Corwin was responsible for the executions of the accused witches, and a curse wrought upon him took effect soon after Corey's execution. Corwin died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 30 and was buried in the cellar of the home for fear that angry villagers would dig up his grave and tear his remains to shreds. It was years later when his body was moved to the Broad Street Cemetery. In late October of 1789, George Washington stayed on the second floor.
Old Town Hall is the earliest surviving municipal structure in Salem and was featured in the movie Hocus Pocus. It was used as the exterior for the Halloween party.
The Grimshaw House is where Nathaniel Hawthorne met his future wife, Sophia Peabody. Names from the gravestones in the nearby cemetery often appear in his writings.
The Old Bearing Point Cemetery is the most popular and oldest cemetery in Salem, and the second oldest in the country, which dates back to 1632. This burial ground includes the resting places of Judges John Hawthorne and Bartholomew Gedney, Giles Corey's second wife Mary, and the junior minister of the First Church, and the relentless prosecutor Reverend Nicholas Noyes.
On August 5th, 1992, the 300th anniversary of the witch trials, a rectangular area was carved out in the corner of the cemetery for a memorial to honor the memory of the witchcraft victims, which includes stone slabs engraved with the 20 names of the fallen and their dates of death.
The traditional route taken by the condemned in the two-wheeled ox cart from the Old Witch Gull to Gallows Hill was through St. Peter's Street, then called Prison Lane, down Essex Street, and then turn left onto Proctor Street. At that time, only a cart road skirting a low hill and deposited the condemned for execution. When the latter was pushed away from the nooses around their necks, the executed would spin off and slowly and painfully strangle to death from a branch from a large tree, a common tradition at the time.
Most believe the bodies were thrown directly into a shallow ditch, for it was against the law to give condemned criminals a Christian burial in a churchyard or consecrated cemetery. At least 3 victims from 1692, Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, and George Jacobs, were brought back by relatives, salvaged in the wee hours of the night, and given a proper burial in unmarked graves on their families' properties.
Benjamin Nurse had rowed a boat from a creek near the Nurse homestead out into the North River, and then to the base of the Gallows Hill to recover his mother's body. The remains of the other 16 victims are believed to be dumped in either a ditch or within the rocky crevices surrounding what is now called Gallows Hill Park.
There was a so-called witch tree as late as 1793, where it was the custom to pass newborns through its trunk hole for protection from witches. Proctor's Ledge, a wooded city-owned area between Proctor and Pope Streets and described as a rocky ledge at the base of the hill, has been considered the most likely spot since the early 1900s, where a new memorial now stands.
Old Burial Hill was established in 1638, one of the oldest graveyards in New England, site of the first meeting house and 600 Revolutionary heroes, though only a handful still have their weathered markers, and several early pastors are interred at the top of the hill. The cemetery has numerous interesting headstones, many still in good shape, carved with winged death's heads that were customary of earlier times. This historic cemetery features scenic vistas of Marblehead Harbor and Salem Sound.
Red's Pond was named for Wilmot Red, a Marblehead woman accused of witchcraft, arrested May 28, 1692, on a warrant issued by magistrates Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne, and examined in Salem Village, which is present-day Danvers, on 31st of May, 1692. Wilmot Red was not the most popular among her peers and described as a crusty old woman. The elderly woman was the wife of a fisherman named Samuel Red. She denied the accusations vehemently. At her examination, the afflicted girls cried out that her specter tormented them and urged them to sign the devil's book. When Susanna Sheldon, one of the afflicted girls, was ordered to approach Red, she was knocked down before she came to her, and being so carried to send Red into a fit, was made well after said Red had grasped her arm. Ambrose Gale, with Charity Pittman and Sarah Dottie, testified that Wilmot Red had cursed a Mrs. Sims with an enduring case of constipation. Wilmot Red was tried at the September 17th sitting of the Court of Oyer and Terminer and executed on September 22nd. Her house once stood in the vicinity of the pond upon the hill by the meat house. This cemetery has a memorial for Wilmot, placed there by the town near where her house once stood. Wilmot was the only citizen of Marblehead executed for witchcraft. Ambrose Gale's wife Mary is buried here. Her epitaph reads, "Here lieth ye body of Mary Gale, ye wife of Ambrose Gale, aged 63 years, died February 5th, 1694/5. There is a monument to the 65 men who lost their lives at sea when a hurricane took 11 fishing vessels from Marblehead on September 19, 1846, in the Great Banks of Newfoundland. This cemetery is referenced briefly in H.P. Lovecraft's 1923 short story, The Festival, that takes place in the fictional city of Kingsport, inspired by Marblehead. Lovecraft has said, "I saw that it was a burying ground where black gravestones stuck ghoulishly through the snow like the decayed fingernails of a gigantic corpse."
Reverend John Hale built this farmhouse in 1694 with possible structural members from an earlier parsonage. In this house in 1697, after his wife's death, he wrote his brief history of Salem tragedy entitled A Modest Inquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft, condemning his colleagues who played leading roles in the trials. Hale lived here until his death on the 15th of May in 1700. Additions included a 1745 gable-roofed ell facing Hale Street and now contains the main entrance. Generations of descendants succeeded him in the house until 1937, when they sold it to the Beverly Historical Society and Museum. This historic colonial house is now operated by a nonprofit museum by the Beverly Historical Society, with period furnishings and a room containing witchcraft-related artifacts.
The house faced south and included a half cellar on its west side, which was composed of dry laid fieldstones, and which was entered by means of a stairway from the porch, front entry. The east side of the house did not include a cellar, the house sills resting on ground stones. The first floor consisted of 2 rooms separated by the front entry and massive brick chimney structure. 2 bed chambers were located on the second floor. Each of the house's 4 rooms included a fireplace. By 1692, a salt box lean-to was attached to the rear of the house and used as a kitchen. Reverend George Burroughs first lived in this house, 1681 to 83, followed by Reverend Deodat Lawson, 1684 to 88, author of the first volume about Salem village witchcraft. In 1689, Reverend Samuel Parris, his wife Elizabeth, daughter Elizabeth, and niece Abigail Williams came to live here until 1696. It was in this house in 1692 that Tituba, Reverend Parris's slave, told the girls of the household stories of witchcraft, which nurtured the village witchcraft hysteria and subsequent legal proceedings that resulted in the imprisonment of over 150 persons and the deaths of 25, including former parsonage resident George Burroughs. Continued to be occupied by other Salem Village and Danvers ministers, Joseph Green, noted diarist and area peacemaker, 1698 to 1715. Peter Clark, famed theological author, 1715 to 68. And Benjamin Wadsworth, who had the old 1681 parsonage finally torn down in 1784, and the land reverted to a pasture. By 1970, the property was owned by Alfred and Edie Ann Hutchinson, who were approached by history student Richard B. Trask with a proposal to find and excavate the site. The resulting Danvers dig was accomplished through the efforts of numerous volunteers assisted by archaeologist Roland Wells Robbins. In 1988, with state assistance, the town of Danvers purchased the site as an historic landmark.
In February 1681, the Salem village inhabitants voted, "We will build a house for the ministry and provide convenient land for that end." The dimensions of the house are as followeth: 42 foot long, 20 foot broad, 13 foot stewed, 4 chimneys, no gable ends. Sandra and I and the entire team at New England Anomalies Research would certainly like to thank you for joining us on our excursion to the beautiful historic locations in Salem and Danvers, Massachusetts. The history of the witch hysteria that took place in 1692 and 1693 certainly serves as a lesson today in basic human rights and tolerance. For Ghosts R N.E.A.R, I'm Keith Johnson. Thank you for watching.